from mushrooms. What grows in the dark? What can grow? Rhubarb. Rhubarb grows in the dark, doesn't it? Forced rhubarb, I think it's called. Very popular in certain parts of Yorkshire. And because it's so desperately reaching for the sunlight, the rhubarb strains every sinew to head ever higher. But generally speaking, you starve something of oxygen or you deny something light, and it withers and dies. It's not an entirely helpful analogy, that, or indeed clutch of analogies, because the other danger is, of course, that if you leave something in the dark to flourish like fungus, then you won't notice how bad a problem has become until it overtakes you. We're going to be talking about the so-called protest in Trafalgar Square on Saturday, and I even, as someone who does this stuff for a living, the absolute horror and shock I felt at stuff that was being said by people with amplified microphones up on the stage. The last person to baffle me, really, with where all the organisation came from was when the fellow who lost all that money last week to a Syrian refugee used to turn up outside court with sort of trailers and amplifiers and microphones and spout his drivel. But this was drivel of an entirely different order. This was in the middle of London, if you weren't following the story. I'm not quite sure what it is they're protesting against anymore. There was a Trump 2024 banner very prominently displayed in the crowd, which surprised me not a jot. And then up on the stage, people like David Icke, do you remember him? And Piers Corbyn, who presumably wouldn't merit a mention or indeed an invitation in these sort of areas if it wasn't for the identity of his brother, the former leader of the Labour Party. And then this strange former nurse who said stuff that I can't quite believe is legal, to be honest with you, although obviously I'm not a lawyer. She goes by the name Kate Shemarani. And it poses a problem that we're going to explore together. Let me get out of the way early, indeed first up, the potential. Hypocrisy is not quite the right word, but there is I do appreciate the tension in saying to you, let's have a phone-in question predicated upon the question of whether or not we should be talking about the thing that we're having a phone-in about. It's a bit like, I don't think I've ever done, in fact I must have done this, but I try not to, which is, should newspapers print that picture? Go to lbc.co.uk, have a look and tell me now on 0345 606 0973. Do you see what I mean? I don't know how else to do it, though, because I really do want to have a conversation with you about whether or not, or how, perhaps, is the best question we should be talking about this sort of stuff. How important is it? I don't know. Today is a good day in the context of infections, and I know how weird that sounds, given that we are fifth in the world for new cases, behind much, much bigger countries like India, Brazil, and the US. Indonesia is out on top. We're currently fifth. France is sixth. So, in the context of the last week or so, the last 2 weeks or so, that's actually really good news. We're in the green zone for the first time, I think, ever outside lockdown. The first time ever that we've seen a dip in daily rates while we weren't actually in lockdown. But there are various theories about why this may not be the unalloyed good news that every single one of us wants it to be. But as I explained a moment ago, we wait until Friday to find out. Do you know the difference in this? So what the ONS survey does is take a random sample of people and test them. So that way, you're getting asymptomatic people, i.e. people who probably don't even know that they've got it. You're getting a reading of how much infection is in the country by actually testing a sample of the country and timesing it to put the population in place. Do you see what I mean? So you test, say there's 60 million people in the country and you test 1,000 people. You times it by... you times it by whatever you need to times it by to turn 1,000 into 60 million. So that's how they do it. And that's different from what we see every day. For example, we're not testing school children every morning anymore. So that's bound to have had an impact, particularly asymptomatic school children. That's bound to have an impact on the number of people reporting positive tests. So we have to wait and see. But I think it's important to understand this. Every day is a school day. The ONS test is the really, really reliable one because that is like a cross-section of the country rather than a reflection in part of how much testing is being done and how many positive results are being reported. So, Saturday. Do you want to hear a bit of it? See, already I'm not sure we should play it. We've had frenzied debates in the studio this morning. We've had quite serious conversations, contemplations. Cogitations. Something else that begins with C and ends in ation. Coronation? No, we haven't had any coronations. But I genuinely don't know. I think by now we have spent enough time together to embark upon this conversation in a spirit of trust and openness. I really do. I think by now we can do this. If people want to make mischief about it or accuse us of irresponsibility, then I think you and I know that wouldn't be true. So it's a weird world we live in, where you can clip up stuff out of context or you can make claims about programs you've never listened to. I want to have a conversation about whether or not we should be having a conversation about stuff like this.
Ask those that are giving it. Has there been any deaths? Ask them what is in it. Ask them. Get their names. You email them to me, the medical revolutionaries at protonmail.com, with a group of lawyers. We are collating all that. At the Nuremberg trials, the doctors and nurses stood trial, and they hung. If you are a doctor or a nurse, now is the time to get off that bus. Get off it and stand with us, the people. All around the world, they are rising.
Now, the reason why we're talking about this today is probably best explained by a couple of comments from NHS workers that have appeared on Twitter and are reported in the Times today. Here is Kate Jarman, who is the Director of Corporate Affairs at Milton Keynes University Hospital. So she would be the go-to for communications issues and similar. We've had letters accusing us of genocide. I've had similar over social media. I expect every doctor, nurse and NHS employee who has any kind of social media or public profile has done. It's abhorrent. Dr. Samantha Batt-Rawdon, who is an ICU doctor, said, as an ICU doctor who has given everything trying to save lives, this makes me want to cry. A spokesman for the Metropolitan Police tells us that the remarks are being investigated. For the record, the book I've been plugging furiously for the last couple of weeks, not one of mine, Vaxxers by Dr. Catherine Green and Professor Sarah Gilbert, actually lists the ingredients in the AstraZeneca vaccine. It tries to tackle head-on the sort of misinformation and dangerous propaganda that women like that have become famous propagating and spreading. And I don't even know whether that works. You know, do you fix a problem by acknowledging it and then solving it when people are utterly persuaded that they are, I don't know, victims of some global conspiracy? I mentioned to you last week that I try occasionally, when I'm not busy bullying people, I try occasionally on Twitter to just when I think someone looks sensible or susceptible to a little bit of reason, 9 times out of 10 they're not, which is why one tries less and less. But I tried to point out to somebody the other day that something they'd sent me about the Pfizer vaccine was hogwash, and it had been fact-checked by Reuters and shown to be hogwash. And he came back saying, well, I think you'll find the chairman of Roy Thomson Reuters is on the board of Pfizer, so they're lying to you. And I just thought, I can't reach you. I can't reach you. Have I made it worse by trying to? Are there people looking at this now, this exchange? My Twitter, for those of you who've got better things to do with your life, has become something of a tourist attraction. Dominic Cummings and I were having an interesting exchange of views last night. And so does that make it worse now? Has someone looked at that and thought, yes, the chairman of Thomson Reuters is on the board of Pfizer, someone who doesn't know a lot about non-executive directorships and, you know, the interplay between big global companies, might go away thinking, well, maybe there's no smoke without fire. Do you see? I'm fairly confident that clip I just played you there, calling for doctors and nurses to stop caring for people and alluding to the fact that Nazi murderers who were qualified medics were hung after the Nuremberg trial. I'm fairly confident. And remember, we live in a world that elected Donald Trump, so you can only ever be fairly confident that nobody's going to have listened to that clip and thought, ooh, I might get myself a bit of that. And that's what makes me think that shining a light on this sort of stuff is a disinfectant. even, dare I say, perhaps a form of vaccine, a form of cure. This fella has been, I think, thrown off Twitter in the last few days.
And they will tell these storytellers how the demons persuaded millions, billions around the world to believe in their plan to bring global tyranny to this world. A plan that involved a fake virus, a fake test, and fake death certificates to give the illusion of a deadly disease that has never and does not exist.
Okay. I mean, you'd shout nurse in normal circumstances, but this is no laughing matter. That's David Icke, who I think used to play in goal for Northampton Town, claiming that the world is, under the thrall of demons. I think he once claimed that the Queen was a lizard, although I may have slightly misremembered that. And I keep thinking of Donald Trump, because I keep thinking that this stuff can't be ignored. If you ignore it, you end up with a January the 6th type situation. You end up with people marching upon legislatures, baying for the blood of a vice president. Sent there, of course, by the actual former president. But thankfully, we don't yet have a public figure of such prominence who's buying into this sort of hogwash. So what do you think? Let's just... Yeah, right, I'll level with you. I'm asking you to do the heavy lifting this morning because I'm really, really torn. I've obviously made the decision, but this might be the last time we talk about this. Anthony Fauci was part of my considerations as well, warning about how unvaccinated areas where this sort of nonsense or diluted versions of this nonsense has taken hold. I think it's probably important to address it, but I want to know what you think. So that's question number one. But what do you think we should do about this sort of stuff? Can you completely ignore it? The Metropolitan Police are investigating it. The Times is reporting it. The Mayor of London is condemning it. LBC, JOB is discussing it. I think it's the right thing to do. But you know what I'm like these days. I'm very rarely 100% certain about anything except Brexit. 15 minutes after 10 is the time. 0345 60 60 973 is the number you need. As Paul says, cheers for that, Jim. You've just made me feel sick. And I think that's a good thing, Paul, in the circumstances, as I'm sure you do too. Yeah, as you know, you can't reason people out of things that they haven't been reasoned into. Throwing one of my favourite phrases back at me. But is that true? I would have thought, anybody who thought that the people in Trafalgar Square on Saturday possessed even a scintilla of sense will have listened to the last 14 minutes of this broadcast and been cured of that suspicion. Which is why we've done it. But what do you think? Should we? 0345 60 60 973. A little later in the hour or in the programme, we'll hear from, or we will invite calls from NHS workers who have been in receipt of the sort of abuse described earlier. I'm keen to hear from you. I'm keen to offer you a shoulder, put an arm around you, actually, and do so on behalf of all of my listeners. And then, of course, the hardy perennial, the question with which we've addressed all of these issues from almost the very beginning of this mess. What do you do if someone you love has fallen down this mine shaft of madness? And bizarrely, that former nurse who was coming out with the most unbelievable nonsense, evil nonsense, her own son has given a couple of interviews in which he expresses his utter desolation at what has happened to his own mother. So that question of what do you do if someone you love has fallen, I think I'm going to stick with that alliterative phrase, this mineshaft of madness, is really urgent for you, and absolutely riveting in an important and responsible way for the rest of us. The former nurse that we played a little clip from earlier, I can't remember whether or not I added that she has subsequently been struck off by the Nursing and Midwifery Council for spreading misinformation about COVID. Her son, who I mentioned, has described her as having a God complex, as if this attention or this, I don't know what you call it, infamy, is addictive and intoxicating. And I do understand that. And that's part of the problem I've got today with the worry about whether or not we should even be talking about it. If you want to join in from any of the angles that we've mentioned, 0345 60 60 973 is the number you need. Charlie is in Hitchin. Charlie, what do you reckon?
Well, first of all, James, I think it's absolutely disgusting what these people are getting away with and sort of being allowed to be said.
Yes.
There is in no way justifiable. However...
is there a however? Go on.
Yes, however, ultimately, we have to also respect the fact that there is sort of freedom of speech in this country. And on one hand, if we're going to argue against Priti Patel and her kind of sort of anti-protest bill... we have to allow these people the freedom to speak.
Are you sure? I mean, there are parameters here. The Meta investigating, and if there was a suspicion of incitement to violence, then that wouldn't be covered by... I mean, you know the old, what people say. So you're not allowed to shout fire in a crowded cinema or in a crowded theatre, are you? So there are limits on freedom of speech.
Absolutely, James. Like, freedom of speech, so it doesn't mean freedom from consequence. Ultimately, sort of, if they are doing something illegal, if they are spreading hate speech, then this needs to be investigated by the proper authorities.
And it is being. Let me just steer you back. I think sure. I'm going to try and have a day without thinking about Priti Patel, if it's all right with you. I think we all need a day like that once in a while. Let me steer you back to whether or not this is going to go a little bit Truman Show now, or a bit meta, as the intellectuals say. Should you and I, Charlie, be having this conversation live on national radio now? Should we? Not should they be silenced or should they be allowed to have the protest, but should we actually be talking about it now?
Well, absolutely. Of course we should. We should, sort of, if they're free to, like you sort of shout absolute nonsense, then we should be free to sort of call them out on it.
No, I know we're free to. It's not a question of whether we're allowed to or not, because if we're not allowed to, I'm giving them your name, mate. I'm running for the hills. You can answer to Ofcom for this one. If we're not allowed to have this conversation, is it... I like to think of myself as a responsible journalist. There's plenty who aren't, and I'm sure sometimes I fail. But is this responsible? Is it responsible to draw any attention at all to this sort of nonsense?
Well, James, ultimately, I think that they're sort of drawing a lot of attention to themselves anyway. The attention is already there. I don't think there's anything wrong with discussing it and with talking about how it might be wrong,
Yes, and also I sometimes see MSM aren't talking about this, so it must all be true. And then a little bit of me, but I hope that's not a sort of childish psychological response from me. That little, well, okay, then we will talk about it just to prove to you that we're not talking about it because it's all true. I don't know if that gets all so convoluted and crazy as well. But here we are having this conversation about, you're of the view that they should, within the parameters of free speech, of course they should be allowed to say it. How interested are you in where all the money comes from or the funding? I've got a fascinating story to share a little later this hour about some YouTubers who've blown the whistle on a really scary anti-vax plot. But I don't know where presumably they crowdfund, do they, and stuff like that?
Well, I'll be honest with you, James, I don't actually know a great deal about where the money comes from, so I'm not going to...
But that's what we're supposed to do. Follow the money, isn't it? Or is that from Watergate, isn't it? Isn't it from All the President's Men? I think follow the money. I think it is. I'm probably wrong. 25 minutes after 10. Charlie, thank you. Phil's in Malvern. Phil, what do you think? I can't keep asking every caller whether or not I should be taking their call, but do you think I should be taking your call?
Well, I hope so, James. First time on the radio. Going through your filtration process is. I hope you're going to talk to me. No, I've been following this on Twitter over the weekend, and I just think there's something. I hate. It almost seems like you're raising a conspiracy theory against conspiracy theorists. So, but it feels like there's a lot of money floating around in these sort of events, and I don't know how they would have got the permission to set up a huge stage.
Oh, well, that's the same as everybody else, Even that little fellow who lost all that money to the Syrian refugee last week could get permission to set up his ludicrous platforms all over the place. That is one of the things that has... The last fellow reminded us I lasted 4 minutes trying not to mention or think about Priti Patel all day. But that is one of the things that her new legislation has in its sights. So, I mean, it's interesting, but equally every weirdo and his wife on social media is passing a hat around asking for donations all the time.
Yeah.
Is it responsible to talk about stuff that is so out there with the defence I'm using, which is if you don't, then it spreads, more people fall for it.
Well, I mean, I also believe that the particular speech which was most probably offensive about the nursing profession, I mean, taking something that was obviously the Nazi medical profession, we're in a totally different, that was a totally different regime. And to equate that with what our medical profession are doing now is an obscene sort of comment. I know, as I said, we've always got this dilemma with free speech, but, when does free speech become just hate speech? And that seems to be the dilemma we've got with media and social
and that's
media.
that's for the police to decide, isn't it? It's and we'll have to wait and see what.
Well, and I'm hoping. I mean, even his son has come out against his
Sebastian.
mother,
He has Sebastian Shemirani.
Yeah.
That's brave, isn't it? That's principle to do that.
Yeah, I think that does maybe shine a light on the the
scale of the problem, and when your own son is feeling it, and such. There was other stuff as well. I'm going to find it. We're referring to. I'm not sure which one of these weirdos said it, but referring to the serial numbers on the vaccine containing the number of the beast or something like that. I did. I mean, I have to say, Phil, you probably don't know this, but at the boarding school I went to, it was run by monks, and there was actually an exorcist on the books. One of the monks was the official monastery exorcist, which we all thought was hilarious. I'm glad you laughed. We all thought that was hilarious. Then we watched The Omen. Have you seen The Omen? Yeah, then we watched The Omen and we weren't laughing anymore. We were staying on his good side, just in case any of us were subjected to demonic possession. So, if the Catholic Church recognises the possibility of demonic possession right up to the very highest level, I don't know how much right we've got to laugh at former footballers turning up and talking about it on a stage in Trafalgar Square. But I don't know. I just worry that by talking about it today, we're going to have some people listening going, "Oh, I might look into that. I don't like demons. I might try and find out more."
That's the point I was going to just make. That my feeling deep down, I'm almost hoping that people who are in the crowd actually finding this like an entertaining afternoon, an afternoon's entertainment, and not taking it at all seriously. But I mean, when they're cheering some of the comments, you're thinking, what is going through your head?
And some of the posters in the crowd as well. I suppose, out of respect for Sebastian Shemirani, talking about his mum, this struck off former nurse Kate Shemirani. At the Nuremberg trials, the doctors and nurses stood trial and they hung. If you are a doctor or a nurse, now is the time to get off that bus and stand with us, the people. What do you do? Do you have a family member who was there on Saturday, or who is there in spirit? How do you do it? I mean, this lad has had to come out. You see his face, the poor fella, and he still loves her. It's his mum, but he's had to come out and talk, presumably in the hope of helping others, but also, I imagine, to help himself as well, almost as a form of therapy. How do you make sense of having someone in your life that has gone this far out of normality? It is fascinating, isn't it, this question of how it happens, in whose interest is it? And do not let me go home today without telling you the tale of some YouTubers who were contacted by a mysterious marketing agency and offered quite a lot of money to spread nonsense about vaccines. And it's a really interesting story. Remember, before all of the Brexit and Trump and sundry other areas where social media was manipulated and infiltrated to tell people lies in the hope of securing their votes, by far the biggest nonsense being disseminated on social media coming out of Russia was reported to be about the MMR vaccine. So that just idea of disrupting Western democracies doesn't have to make sense. That's all it's about. But that remind me to talk you through the details of that story. Coming at the story from a few angles today, a really scary protest in Trafalgar Square on Saturday where various people, we don't need to keep naming because one imagines that gives them a little frisson of excitement, but various weirdos made various outlandish claims about everything from the vaccine being a massive hoax perpetrated by demons, through to comparing modern workers in the NHS to sort of Joseph Mengele style monsters from the Nazi era. And I'm increasingly confident, actually, that it is the right thing to talk about it because we're talking about it in the right way. I'm also interested in what do you do when someone you love falls down that mine shaft of madness, as we've elected to call it, because the woman who appears to be the ringleader of this, her own son, poor lad, has come out now and given a couple of very powerful interviews describing his horror at what his mother has turned into, or at least what she is doing. 10:36 is the time. Ivor is in Crystal Palace. Ivor, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Yeah, I think to sort of answer the question that you've been asking this morning, I think you're absolutely right to be having these conversations, and I would say, and it breaks my heart to say this, but we need to have more of them.
Okay.
I've lost basically a relationship with both a brother and a sister to this, and my relationship with one of my parents is pretty much hanging by a thread and has been for some time since the first lockdown. And I think the reason why we need to talk about this is not so much to try and convince those that are already down rabbit holes to think differently. In the overwhelming majority of cases, those people need to go through what they need to go through. They need the time that they need to work through it. And if some of them see the light and turn around, then so be it. But it's not going to, as you've said before, it's not going to come from reasoned discussions with most other people. I think the reason we need to talk about this is actually to protect ourselves for the rest of us that need to know that there are conversations to be had, that there are other people that aren't, that there are other people out there that are going through what they're going through, because I think there are thousands of families up and down the country right now that are feeling the embarrassment and the shame and the sadness that my family has felt for years over this. And for a lot of us, this predates the pandemic. We've got relatives that were vulnerable going into this, and this has just exacerbated the conspiratorial woo-woo and nonsense that they've been feeding on for many, many years. And the combination of a global pandemic, a digitized public square, the ability to be able to go online and within minutes feel like you're part of a global community that is real and exciting and huge and change is just around the corner and it's globally or even galactically significant. I mean, this is catnip for the conspiratorial mind. And the sad bit of it is I understand why people find this stuff so compelling and attractive, because I grew up with a lot of this. I know that conspiratorial mind. I've been hearing about David Icke for the last 30 years. I know these guys, and I know the power that they have over people that are predispositioned to this stuff. And it takes years and years and years, in my case, of, thank goodness, education, real life, a career that's taken me outside of my social circle, around the world, working with all sorts of different fascinating people. I've had my eyes opened.
Were you in it yourself before, or were you just in danger of falling?
I think with a lot of people, and it's interesting you mentioned Sebastian Shemirani, when he talked about his mum. You know, that's a family that grew up in a very religious environment, and I grew up in quite a I wouldn't say cult-like. I think that would be sort of taking it a little bit too far. But I grew up in a very sort of conservative Christian family that was very susceptible to some of the more the Trumpian fringes of very a very reactionary, Americanized evangelical Christianity, which is obsessed with the end times. It's obsessed with the New World Order. It's obsessed with a lot of these sort of tropes that are so easily sort of.
What is it? Is it the end is nigh and we will be saved? Is that the initial sell? We're probably oversimplifying things, but that idea of being the chosen few.
I think it's more fundamental than that, James. I think what it is we are the elect. We are the saved. We are part of something bigger than ourselves, and the majority don't see it, but we see it. Okay. either the persecuted minority or the special elect that do see it. We've seen the light. We're part of something here, and the sense of belonging and connection that gives people is actually very, very powerful.
Yes, of course.
So what you're saying to someone who's gone down these rabbit holes is it's a very difficult challenge for a lot of people, because what you're saying is you need to let go of this, but you also need to let go of the sense of belonging and connection and community that you now feel with a globalized.
Well, they call it deprogramming, don't they? They're deprogramming in a cult context.
But you're also having to pull people away from the sense that they're part of a larger community. I would say that the idea that they're part of a community is a lie. It's not a real community. 9 times out of 10, it's not people they've ever met. It's people they've just met online.
Yes, of course.
But you're actually pulling people away, not just from crazy ideas, but you're pulling them away from what is now a very real and experienced
support structure. I'm hearing you describe almost a sort of psychological support structure, the constant revalidation of each other and turning in like a hall of mirrors, and all you ever see is your own reflection coming back at you, and you don't realise that it's distorted because it's all you ever see. I don't want to pry unduly, Ivor, but what was, and I'm certainly conscious of oversimplifying what continues to be a horrible personal situation for you, but are there pivot points? Are there moments where you think, I give up, I've got to look after myself now?
Absolutely. And I think the analogy that I use when I'm talking to other members of the family that have been pulling their hair out with this is, I've found myself saying so many times over the years, guys, we've got to learn how to put our own oxygen mask on, to use the analogy of masks.
Yes.
You have to be able to put your own oxygen mask on, and it feels uncaring in a way to switch yourself off from somebody who is so clearly down a rabbit hole. They are effectively a lost cause. You will tie yourself up in knots with sadness and guilt and shame, and I don't mind admitting it, embarrassment to be associated with somebody like that. But you've got to find a way of looking after yourself and putting that oxygen mask on, and providing support to others in the family or others in the wider social network that need to know that they're not alone with those feelings as well. And I think that goes back to my point at the beginning. I think that's why, as a society, we need to talk about this as much to give each other the support, because there are so many people up and down the country that are dealing with this, and they need to know that they're not crazy just because they're affiliated with a family that seems to be crazy. Sure. They need to know that they're not alone. And I think these conversations are as much about the rest of us as they are about trying to persuade those that, quite frankly, are unpersuadable at the moment.
And that is, well, I couldn't have done that without you. I couldn't even have scratched the surface of what you've just dug deeply into. So thank you, and I'm sorry. I say this quite often to callers, but I don't know if it's ever weighed quite as heavily on my conscience as it does with you. I'm so sorry that you're so qualified to contribute in this way.
Well, James, can I just return the compliment? The work that you're doing on LBC around this, in terms of having, and not just on this issue, but on so many issues of divisiveness and populism and just unbridled nonsense, you're doing such a good job, and it really means a lot to so many people. So I'm not sort of wanting to.
No, that's I'd take that in the spirit that it's intended. I'm very grateful. You have a bit. So you have a bit actually, but thank you.
Good work.
Okay, I shall.
That's important stuff.
Like I said, I can't do it without people like you. Thank you. And I hadn't even thought of that. You know, that idea of it being a sort of corrective to the craziness, as opposed to a cure. This is a way to perhaps stop other people from going down that route. And God, you could hear in his voice, couldn't you? Well, that must be like. And Emma, who is one of my resident experts on such matters, points out that most people don't actually believe in demons anymore. So all this talk of a new world order, she suggests, is a transference of that idea of outer evil. It ties in with a lot of what Ivor was saying about religion and about, the worst ramifications of religion. It becomes it gives you an enemy to fight, which becomes cohesive. It's why, and I'm overreaching possibly now, but it's one of my most enduring areas of interest. It's why there's so much homophobia in so many religious movements, because if you give them a common enemy, it becomes a uniting force. So why do so many religions preach hatred of homosexuality? Answer, it gives them an enemy that can never actually hurt them. They're the best kind of false enemies, aren't they? It can never actually hurt them, but you can use it as a uniting force for your fire and brimstone preaching just before, of course, just before you pass around the collection plate. I'm going to crack on with calls. I'm getting some incredibly powerful messages in as well. I do my best to read as many as I can, always. I will read a couple, because otherwise it seems disrespectful and ungrateful. James, my brother-in-law is a fervent anti-climate change and anti-vaxxer, even forcing his wife not to have her jabs. We made the mistake of criticising Trump and discovered he's a big Trump fan as well. It's strange how these beliefs go together, isn't it? Yes. He also believes the Earth is only 5,000 years old. We struggle to keep in contact with the family now, but persevere to ensure that his wife isn't isolated. And Jack adds, keep talking, which addresses the question I began the programme with now, although after reading messages like that and speaking to people like Ivor, I'm fairly comfortable with that problem. James, it's absolutely devastating. My new girlfriend is Polish, and the Polish experience of government has led to a severely low vaccine take-up. I haven't checked that, Gareth, but I'll take your word for it. And she's too afraid of there being long-term consequences. But that's not the biggest worry for me, because I think her fears are a result of her circumstances and so make sense, and her stance may change. But my best friend, who lives in Finland, has spent the past few years working from home on his computer, and during the pandemic he's found himself down various rabbit holes on YouTube and the internet more widely, and now uses words like tyranny about vaccinations on his Twitter posts. It's made me feel at a complete loss. I'm not sure I know him much anymore, and Ivor's contribution to the programme resonating with an awful lot of people. Kevin's in Woking. Kevin, what made you pick up the phone?
Okay, well, I'm a bit nervous, James.
It's only me.
It's
only me.
So my wife is an ICU doctor, and we just happened to be in London for a birthday meal on Saturday.
Gosh. And
she started getting text messages that, look at this on Twitter, look what's happening.
From friends, from people that she likes.
From colleagues, from colleagues, from friends. And it happened to be that we were just down the road from Trafalgar Square, and she was extremely upset and came back from the toilet, in tears.
Really?
And, we had to get the train home, which we were sat among some of the people who were there.
God.
And, it's given what we've been through in the last 18 months.
Well, I see you doctors arguably more than anybody else at the... I mean, hardly arguably. I just say that in case I've forgotten someone else who, I suppose being bereaved is harder than... But day in, day out, working with people suffering from the worst ravages of this virus, and then to be sitting in a train carriage with people who've just been cheering a bloke saying it's a hoax, it's made up, or it's a result of demonic possession that people even believe in it.
It's the comments particularly about getting the doctors' names.
Yeah.
Immediately she was worrying about that.
Oh, God.
She actually went back to work. She was on maternity leave, but she finished her maternity leave early to go back to work because the situation was so desperate. And
that line there, that line is the one that resonates, isn't it? About send me their names and addresses. It's incredible, actually.
Yeah, and the real, to top this off.
Yeah, go on.
We got home and she was upset about it, and I was trying to sort of rationalise it by saying, well, look at some of the people who are talking at the event.
Yes.
It's a level of crazy that and you can't justify most, the 5G stuff and the things.
And you're right to cite that as almost being reassuring, because what we don't have is a senior elected politician, or God forbid, a president, or major legacy news organisations who've decided, because there's money in it and clicks in it, to go that cynically and dishonestly. They've gone down it in pursuit of support and funding and power. We don't have that in this country, I don't think. And I'm massively resisting the urge to say yet at this point, Kevin. We don't have it yet, because you never know, do you?
But the thing that was then an extra kicker was we got home, and on all the cars on our street, somebody had put leaflets in the windscreen wipers with COVID denial and contact numbers, people to talk to and say, if you're experiencing these symptoms because of your jab, and just bogus figures about death figures and things. Where you say, well, this isn't just happening in London. This is in our neighbourhood. There's people putting this information out there, and I think we're both of the opinion that it's important to have discussions about it, and it's important for high-profile people to come out and discredit this ridiculous information because it's harmful. It's harming the people trying to do their jobs. The people that she's seeing in ICU now, largely unvaccinated, largely under the age of 40, people who, even when they're being put on ventilators, are shouting and screaming about it not being real. You
can't quite believe it, can you? You can't quite believe it. There's weirdly, and I don't know what it's like for your wife when she's, nose to the screen, as it were, but even in this conversation now, there's what, 5% of us? I don't know how much it is for you. 5% of my mind is just almost denying it. It can't be true. You can't have people in the situation and circumstances that you describe, but then you read about it, and you read doctors and nurses describing what you've just described. Is there anything we can do? Does your wife? I'm sure she doesn't. I know she's got you, but does she need to know that the massive majority of the country thinks she's absolutely aces?
I'm sure she'd appreciate that.
Let me tell you. What's her name? I won't ask her name, but please tell her from us that she's an absolute legend, and we love her for what she's doing. That line, it's funny the stuff that gets under my wires, but the idea of going back from maternity leave early strikes me as a really special sacrifice, so that she could continue pursuing her vocation to the exclusion of spending extra time with your new baby, about which congratulations, Kevin.
Thanks.
And do please pass that on, because it's so important for her to know that, everybody who loves her for what she does isn't going to be standing up in Trafalgar Square shouting about it. It's one of those rare areas where social media reaches real life. The loudest, maddest people are the ones that never shut up. Whereas actually the massive majority of kind, reasonable people are usually sort of too busy quietly getting on with their fulfilling lives to be screaming from the rooftops about how much we rate and appreciate and value doctors and nurses. 10:56 is the time. And a lot of... here's another example from CB, who says that last call, this is Ivor, was spot on. My mother's down this rabbit hole. It's utterly isolated her from the family. Her mind has been poisoned by this stuff, and there's no way back. Thank you, James. Keep shining a light on this. It's a tiny thing we're doing compared to what Kevin's wife has done, isn't it? James is in New Cross. James, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Great to speak to you. I think I can echo those words for Ivor. It was such a great call, and I'm really glad he brought religion into it, which I'm going to kind of expand on now. Yeah. And the way I kind of see religion, I don't mean to offend anyone, but I do see it as a form of conspiracy. I'm not in any way putting people who are religious alongside.
It's a belief in something that's fundamentally unprovable.
Yeah, it's a deeply held belief, something in which there's no evidence. And so when someone does fall down this rabbit hole, as it were, it's their sense of religion. It's their way of finding meaning and purpose.
Yes.
And the human brain, the way we are so susceptible to conspiracies is that it's a way for the human brain to find understanding and provide predictability to an inherently unpredictable world.
Yes.
I think it's easier to kind of believe that humans created this virus than it just be this what it is a completely random series of events have had this huge impact on us, which is just crazy to think of, but it's easy to believe this was formed up and this was created by humans. And then this is, you're right, I think, actually, and I hope you haven't offended anyone. I'm religious myself, although it comes and goes, so I'm conscious of sensitivities on this. I always say believing in stuff is fine. It's what that belief then prompts you to do in the real world, as it were, that is potentially problematical, which leads straight into this. But it is a sense of existence being chaotic and random is quite frightening. So you can impose order on it, even if it's not real. It's reassuring. It's reassuring, exactly. Even if it's horrific, just for it to be predictable can provide so much comfort in a weird way. And
that sense of community that I've all referred to, of feeling as if you're supported, feeling as if you're kinship.
And what that reminded me is just that this kind of deep loneliness people have been feeling, which has been spurred on by individualism and the loss of community from that. And there's loads of studies say there's this deep loneliness in society now, and it's growing. So yes, this is going to get bigger because it's providing people with this. And it's similar to, in religion sense, as a gay person, when close family members, close friends become religious, it can hurt. It hurts because, but what I've realised is they are fallible human beings. It's their way of finding meaning in this really strange world, and that I can still love them.
And the funny, just to bring some of my religious listeners back on side, this is the point where one might say to err is human, James, to forgive is divine. But you can make of that what you will, possibly not give it a capital D. But that is, of course, one of the things we try always to remember on this programme, that it's where the compassion for the contempt for the con men comes from. And that applies, I think, in these sort of contexts. My friend Wayne, who you often hear from on the programme, Wayne in Basildon, knows quite a lot about this, having spent some time, I know he's mentioned it on air before, down a rabbit hole, and he concurs with an awful lot of what you say. It's all religious. They all have a common thread about there being something more to life than what we're being told. So the conspiracy is born, and the internet has become the best tool for confirmation bias. I'm not moving on from this yet, partly because of that little message that said keep talking. But if you want to bring a new angle, a new perspective, you know what to do. And just picking up on something that Kevin said, Kevin's wife is an ICU nurse. I'm just going to take a moment just to remind you of what he told us. Kevin's wife is an ICU nurse who came back from maternity leave early so that she could shoulder some of the burdens being faced in her hospital, on her wards. She denied herself time with her newborn baby so that she could look after us, right? And there was a former nurse on the stage in Trafalgar Square on Saturday comparing her to Nazi war criminals. Incredible, really, but we are where we are. And the front page of The Guardian today that tells of an increasing number of young people with coronavirus being admitted to hospital, including to ICU wards. Doctors begging them not to suffer unnecessarily and to get vaccinated. This is the first weekend, of course, after those restrictions were lifted in England, and we all saw the pictures of nightclubs filled with people obviously not wearing masks or even pretending to social distance, and it is unvaccinated young people who urgently need to protect themselves to avoid serious illness. It's one of those little red herrings that's done the rounds, isn't it? Or red herrings, if that's the right word, because you're much less likely to die if you're young. There's no sense of urgency or emergency. But of course, you run a risk of being much, much sicker if you're unvaccinated and you catch it and it goes bad than you would be if you were vaccinated. It's that simple. But of course, the line between people who haven't got around to it yet or people who feel a little bit, what's the word we want? Invulnerable. People who feel a little bit immortal. They're very different constituencies. The people cheering that bilge in Trafalgar Square on Saturday are not people who haven't got around to getting vaccinated yet because it's hard to get the time off work, or because they just, have been far too busy playing World of Warcraft or watching the Olympics or working all the hours that God sends, or I just haven't got around to it yet because I'm 22 and, I'm going to live forever, as Liam Gallagher so famously sang. Was it Liam or Noel? It was Liam, wasn't it? It was, that's another problem we've got together to pick through and to navigate in the best way that we can together, is dealing with people who aren't vaccinated yet but should be, and having conversations about people who have taken leave of their senses is the nicest way I can think of putting it. Another one here from D, who's in the Oval. Family members in America, deeply religious, increasingly alarmed about the amount of money Christian evangelicals have been giving to fringe and far-right activists and talking heads. They're trying to seed conditions for the apocalypse that they're waiting for, which is why so many of them treated Trump as an almost messianic figure. It's also, that belief in the coming apocalypse is also part of the reasoning behind Donald Trump's moving of the American embassy in Israel. I don't know if you're aware of that. That's something else that you could dig into. 7 minutes after 11 is the time. Take a few more calls, and then I will just share with you. It's not like a traffic stopping story. I don't want to over-egg the pudding. But the the question of who's pulling the strings on this intrigues me, and the BBC has carried a rather good report about an online attempt to seed yet more mad misinformation. If you're wondering what I do, I see people I know in IRL, in real life now, on social media, posting stuff that is at first glance bonkers, but then you do the second glance. I usually just put in the name of whoever it is that's appearing in a weird video and just add the words fact check, and then just have a little look at what has been written about. You can believe everything you read on Wikipedia, for example, but, you know, if it says discredited and you are carefully curating your own reputation, then you would put quite a lot of effort into getting the word discredited removed from that kind of thing. So you read that, you read outfits like Thomson Reuters or Fact Check itself, Full Fact. And if the people that your mum or your cousin or your auntie are quoting on Facebook, just put the name in and then add the words fact check, and you get some interesting insights into where these crackpots are coming from. 8 minutes after 11 is the time. Pete's in Leicester. Pete, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, Pete.
This is, quite a personal topic for me. My brother, I'm sorry if we're not 100% on topic with this.
Take your time.
Fell down what I'll call the right-wing rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And it's been sort of over the last 2 years, but this is something that I think I'm really happy you're talking about, that needs to be discussed openly, massively, really.
You mean radicalisation, really, aren't we? Whatever the context is, the process is the same, I think.
So there's 2 points I want to talk about. With my brother, it recently sort of got to the point where he'd call himself a vaccine skeptic, and I kind of had to beg him to get the vaccine. And my mum was begging him, I was begging him, and we've just I know where these views have come from. They've come from YouTube.
Right.
He's unfortunately unemployed at the moment. We've all had a tough year, but
Sure.
we've, in the family, we actually lost my father earlier on, not from the pandemic. He had a brain tumour, so it was sort of a 5-year process. Yeah. But, he even went on to say something insane as, what's that Farage clip? In this country, I think a private healthcare system would be better. Yeah. And I've had cancer when I was younger. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the NHS. We wouldn't be able to afford that. My dad had 5 years of care from the NHS. Why would someone like that have a view like that?
I don't know.
And this goes on to say my point, which I think you'll find quite interesting. There's a young man in America called Caleb Kalin. He did a YouTube video it's titled "How I Got Out of the Right-Wing Rabbit Hole." I've
seen it. He's been working with Hope Not Hate. He used to make films with the little fella who lost all that money to the Syrian refugee last week, didn't he?
I have not seen that, but the New York Times article is fascinating to me, and I can see exactly where my brother got sucked in and where he is now. I can see the patterns. I used to I do talk about my friend all the time, constantly, when we listen to your show, of when you get the people calling in. I know where he's formed. I don't want to sort of name podcasts and YouTubers, but I know where he got in.
You can spot it. You're describing EDL type radicalisation with the case of Caleb Kalin, who you just referred to, aren't you?
No, he is.
Have I got the wrong bloke then?
So he's US-based. So he is. If you type in Caleb Kalin on.
That's fine. I've got him mixed up with someone
the
else.
New York Times article. It's very interesting. But he's a young man. He talks about how he fell down the rabbit hole, and he managed to get out. But he explains in depth how he fell in, what he was feeling at the time, how these people sort of took advantage of his emotions and views and manipulated them. And one thing that doesn't help is the algorithm on YouTube.
I know a lot about this. You watch one and it identify. That's really ugly, isn't it?
It's disgusting. Again, I see my brother quite a lot because I try to talk. I think the way to help people in this situation is to talk to them. I think if we
does that help?
Don't let them talk. 100. I believe it does, because he's at the point where he has been jabbed now, thankfully.
Well done.
But he was getting to the point where, the more you tell me to do it, the less likely I'm going to do it. And I feel like if we silence these people, we're kind of backing them into a corner.
Well, this is the distinction between all the different constituencies, people who are reachable, people who aren't reachable. I mean, all of these Fox News hosts who've been punting very unpleasant anti-vaccine rhetoric have presumably all had it themselves. So, Rupert Murdoch was one of the first people in this country to get jabbed, and he owns Fox News.
If you saw, there was an article, I think it was 2 days ago, saying how the Fox News, they've got a sort of form of vaccine passport in the Fox News building now. You need to get all these presenters and stuff.
So is there a tip you'd give then, having dealt with your brother in this way? And clearly you haven't pulled him back 100% to the light, but keep talking. Is there anything else?
I think keep talking. And again, it does feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall, because, I mean, it's the same with Brexit. It's the same with Trump. He's got what you'd call those typical opinions that you'd expect from that kind of viewpoint. Yes. I think the more you tell people off is the wrong word, but the more you kind of silence and sort of say things, oh, you're ridiculous. I think if you sort of maybe ask them to explain their way out of it, if they say something silly, obviously in my opinion it's silly,
sure.
Like,
where did you get that from, or have you considered this, or where did that...
Not even that, just, can you explain that a bit further? Tell me more about that. And then they kind of talk themselves, they talk over in their own heads. People don't like being told they're wrong. I mean, I think that's just human nature in general. But if you... Exactly. So if you sort of let them talk themselves into thinking... maybe that doesn't actually add up. That isn't quite right.
And that of course, is the antidote to the... I mean, echo chamber is a horribly overused phrase, but if you are only ever hearing a reflection or seeing a reflection of your own position, you possibly... And not to make light of it, but in a way I've made a living out of this by asking questions that I thought were really, really obvious, but people on the other end of the phone have never actually asked them before. So you mentioned Brexit. Most obviously, with me, it would be, so which law is it that you're really looking forward to not having to obey anymore? Which, when I first asked it, I thought it was a stupid question, and then you realise that a lot of the people with the most furiously held opinions about it couldn't answer that one simple question. So it's like sowing a seed, I think, Pete. You don't know whether it's going to sprout, whether it's going to germinate or not, but you sow it in the hope that it might grow into something a little bit more rational / reasonable.
No, I completely agree, and I wish it would. My brother actually voted to remain, and over the last however long it's been now, 4 years, he is on the other side because of words like you've said a million times, sovereignty and stuff like that.
YouTube.
It's
Pete, he's lucky to have you.
Get him out, and I think I will.
He's lucky to have you in his life. He really is, and that's love, actually, isn't it? That is family, and it also takes us back to Sebastian Shemirani, whose mother was the one making the disgusting Nazi comments on the stage, and who felt compelled to go public. The chap I was thinking of is a chap called Caelan Robertson, who was a cameraman, director and editor to a sort of veritable who's who of the far right, who now says that he's a changed man and has asked for forgiveness. My friend Ollie Dugmore over at Joe has done a fascinating interview with him. That's why I got confused with the Christian name. He was right. This chap, Caleb Cain, is very, very interesting. A former far-right activist in America, far-right extremist, saying that you need to change the conversation that you have around online extremism. And I suppose part of the problem we have is that a lot of people will think, how dare he lump me in with that? Brexit, I think, most obviously. It's clearly not fair to suggest that everybody who still thinks Brexit is a good idea is some sort of ranting extremist. But there is a fairly strong chance that you have, in a sense, been radicalised online. 2 billion adverts that I am very patiently waiting for Dominic Cummings to tell me more about during our late-night Twitter exchanges. 2 billion adverts can't have had no impact at all. Otherwise, they wouldn't have spent £3.5 million, much of it unlawfully, on seeding those adverts. So, the idea that Turkey's going to join the EU, or if we vote to leave the European Union, the waiting list in your hospital will get shorter. An awful lot of that stuff just is like the entry level. So I don't want to offend everybody who's still on that particular bandwagon. But you could look at climate change, and you could look at anti-vaccine. And you could add to that in this country Brexit, and in America Donald Trump. And certainly in terms of prominent figures, it's not really a Venn diagram, is it? It's more of a circle. You know, I don't know why climate science and anti-vaccine rhetoric or anti-lockdown rhetoric are so of a piece with, you know, the sort of newspaper columnists and presenters just leaping happily from one to the other without really understanding either, is the kindest way of putting it. But of course, their prominence, their infamy, their profile depends upon the inflations, and it leads to the inflation of the fringes as well, which is how you end up with someone standing up in Trafalgar Square on Saturday comparing doctors and nurses to Nazi war criminals. So here's an interesting thing. This is the story I mentioned to you. I won't give you a chapter, I'll give you a brief chapter and verse on it. So, so-called influencers, Keith thinks he's an influencer, bless him, after last week's adventures on Twitter. The influencers received an invitation from a marketing agency, which was offering them €2,000 in a couple of cases to amplify stories claiming that the AstraZeneca jab was 3 times more dangerous. The Pfizer vaccine was 3 times more dangerous, or had a death rate 3 times higher than the AstraZeneca jab. Categorically, the information provided was not true. But one influencer had been offered to pay, and he decided to go public with the offer as well. A chap called Mirko Drochman, a German YouTuber and journalist who normally ignores offers from brands asking him to advertise their products to his more than 1.5 million subscribers. Well, hang on, I've got 800,000 followers on Twitter. If anyone wants to offer me money to promote that, I'm joking, of course. I was shocked, he said. Then I was curious, what's behind all that? And he looked into it, and a few other influencers came forward as well that had been offered €2,000 to take part. The marketing agency, the BBC, have sort of tracked down, and it's gone offline. But it was set up by somebody in Britain with a Russian business partner, the British partner claiming he knew nothing about what his Russian colleague had been up to. It's a really good story. I'll tweet it, actually, if I haven't already. They tracked down one of the 2 directors of the umbrella company that this marketing agency belonged to, who lived in Durham. He said it was a joint venture between his fellow director, a Russian man, and another person whose identity he didn't know, and then said, in the light of the scandal, we are doing the responsible thing and shutting down AdNow here in the UK. So why would a Russian businessman want to offer money to YouTube influencers to spread lies about vaccines? I'll leave you with that question hanging, but it seems to me to be very much of a piece with what we saw in Trafalgar Square on Saturday. Steve's in Leicester. Steve, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
I liked the fact you had your caller on who talked about kind of loneliness and this being kind of a reason for people to effectively find kind of community and that kind of thing.
Yes.
But I also think that finding kind of truth or true facts has also become arguably difficult because of the fact that I don't think social media companies are doing enough, what with their kind of, verified accounts is kind of Twitter's approach for kind of showing you where you can trust and find information that's trustworthy. But social media companies are not doing enough to help direct people towards reliable information.
There's money in it. And this is the big problem of our age, really, isn't it? And I think that unless you've been down one of these rabbit holes, you don't fully understand how deep and how easy they are. You watch one video just out of curiosity, and then it's a bit like watching one of my videos, and then you get bombarded with loads more, and the next thing you know, you're a massive James O'Brien fan. But if you're watching misinformation and anti-vaccine stuff, suddenly you think it must be real. There's so much of it, and it's all I ever see.
Yeah. I also think, like, growing up, there was always for me an idea that I could trust the information from my GP if I went to the doctors.
Yes.
You could trust kind of your teacher in class, not really politicians, maybe not really celebrities, but there were certain kind of independent from politics ideas of authority, I suppose, authority that was reliable and trustworthy. And I think with the pandemic, probably a negative consequence of it is kind of government has kind of been wrapped in with healthcare. You know, we've seen Chris Whitting's things on the news, and it's kind of the political polarisation has spread into everything else. Everything's become politicised, and people don't have that same trust anymore in institutions they should trust, or they should find trustworthy.
I mean, like, you cannot trust politicians. But I watch those conferences, and it seems to me that Whitty and Valent and Jonathan Van Tam are trying to steer the politician towards the position that is, for my money at least, more trustworthy. Do you not? I mean, it's not. I think that what Jeremy Farrar's new book looks absolutely fascinating, and he credits an awful lot of the carnage to the so-called libertarian instincts of the Prime Minister. Right? But you see them of a piece with each other. You think that somehow the untrustworthiness of the politicians who are currently in charge has infected trust in the medical establishment as represented by the Chief Medical Officer. Is that what you're saying?
I think it must be so hard for individuals that work in the medical profession to see people accusing them of politicising the situation or doing things for political goals when, like you say, they're just trying to report scientific facts that they spend their entire lives
trusted sources working on. And you think it's harder to find trusted sources now than it was when we were kids?
I think it's harder to convince people that they are trusted sources. And I think that I mentioned when I was waiting to kind of come on to the show that trust in politics is a big problem. And I think the fact that kind of manifesto promises aren't kept, and even if you go back through kind of recent years, I mean, it's also difficult that on the show, I agree with you and a lot of callers in terms of criticisms of government policy at the moment. But even though I have that criticism of government and Boris and other ministers, and I don't necessarily think that some of the stuff they say is reliable or trustworthy, I do trust institutions like SAGE, like the NHS, like my local GP in terms of their advice. But I think for a lot of the anti-vaxxers and the kind of protests we've seen on Saturday, your callers have mentioned religion before.
Yes.
Religion is all-encompassing. It drags everything into it. And I think these people that have that same kind of religious belief in terms of anti-vaccination, it ends up infecting everything else. Everyone that kind of stands against them, be it a family member, be it a GP's advice, be it, if they're a teenager, be it your teacher at school, they're all, the enemy. They're all politicised. They're all batting for the, the same team. And the trouble is in that scenario, like I said, how do you convince someone like that trustworthy sources are trustworthy, rather than just saying, okay, go online, look up whatever information you want to, and people end up, believing, like you said, people they never met, sources that they can't necessarily verify or say, I found an article that says different to what you said, and, it's just something that's floating around on Facebook that, they don't really know where these sources or this information has come from.
No, and I'm never quite sure how much to read out of the sort of messages I get from listeners on mornings like this one. Here's an example. I would suggest that you and all your callers read the Book of Revelation, which categorically explains the end times and all that we are experiencing now from this controlling government, and then goes on to give me a list of absolutely, I nearly used an inappropriate word there, which is used to describe the excrement of bats, but I won't say that out loud on the radio. And I don't know. I mean, as you say, that they clearly feel that the people telling them about stuff that's being suppressed, and Rishi Sunak trying to introduce a secret new currency so that he can control us, and Bill Gates putting vaccines in us so that he can read our thoughts. Whoever's telling them that, they have decided to trust, which means that Steve must have a point when he says that the trusted sources, which are not infallible, it's a very important point to make. Nothing is infallible. Everybody makes mistakes. The history of science is dotted with what the sort of scientific equivalent of heresy. Oddly, with people like Galileo, it was also heresy, to go against the scientific status quo of the time, in his case, with heliocentrism and demonstrating after Copernicus that the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around, of course, brought religion into question. It brought in the notion of creation itself into question. So scientists who fly in the face of received wisdom or the status quo pop up throughout history, but they then provide even better explanations for the available evidence. I know Steve knows this. I'm just responding to a couple of my more excitable texters. You don't cite people like Kepler or Copernicus, Galileo, or any of them as a reason why we should listen to some mad person in Trafalgar Square comparing doctors to Nazi war criminals. There's absolutely no bridge there. There's no link there. The scientists who have rewritten the rules of science. You need to read Thomas Kuhn on this and his theory of paradigm shifts. The scientists who have rewritten the rules of science are the scientists who provided even better explanations for the observable evidence. And in Galileo's case, of course, it was the Vatican that were outraged by his proofs and his discoveries because it undermined, they felt, their authority. I've forgotten how many hundreds of years it took them to forgive him.